They told you water was something you poured and lost, something cheap, something obedient. They taught you to watch it vanish into dirt, into hoses, into sprinklers hissing across suburban lawns like tiny acts of forgetting. And while you were being sold raised beds, plastic irrigation kits, moisture meters, miracle soil, an older intelligence was rotting in silence beneath the ruins of an empire that did not merely survive on water, but built floating abundance from it. Cities fed by mirrors of sky, roots drinking from living canals, harvests rising where modern gardeners would see only mud, mosquitoes, and failure. Somewhere between conquest and commerce, that knowledge was buried, not because it was weak, because it was dangerous. Because a garden that feeds itself from water alone does not need much from the people who profit off your confusion. So step quietly now. Leave the bright packaging, the loud advice, the exhausted dogma at the gate. We are entering a colder chamber of memory, where agriculture was once closer to architecture, ritual, and war than hobby. This is Garden Rebellion, where the soil remembers what the industry prefers you never learn. Subscribe and stay with me, because tonight we begin opening a drowned archive, one that may change how you see every bed, every root, and every wasted drop in your garden. Imagine for a moment that the garden is not a patch of ground, but a negotiation with gravity. That is where this old method begins, not with fertilizer, not with imported bags of engineered perfection. It begins by refusing the lie that roots must live in dry obedience. The Aztec mind understood something modern gardening culture still struggles to accept. A plant does not fear water nearly as much as it fears stagnation, suffocation, and the stupidity of bad design. Give it movement. Give it oxygen. Give it a platform above a living reservoir, and the entire equation changes. The ritual is almost insultingly simple once you see it. You begin by choosing a shallow zone where water can be held, guided, or repeatedly replenished. A pond edge, a lined trench, a low basin that can stay damp without becoming a dead swamp. Then you build upward, not with sterile perfection, but with layers of rough organic matter that breathe. Brushwood first, then reeds, stalks, twigs, half-rotted stems, leaves, compost, and a cap of darker growing material on top. The bed rises above the waterline like a raft that has decided to become land, not floating loose in fantasy, but anchored, stable, moist from below, alive at its edges. The roots descend through warmth and texture, and eventually discover the cool, dark breath beneath them. That is the turning point. After that, watering stops being an act of constant rescue and becomes something closer to stewardship. When this is done correctly, the bed feels different under the hand. Press your palm into it at dawn, and it does not crumble like exhausted potting mix. It gives. It exhales. There is a quiet chill underneath the surface, even after heat has licked the top dry. In summer, when conventional beds begin to panic, this kind of structure keeps whispering moisture upward. Capillary rise does the work. Biology does the work. The decay of buried plant matter creates sponge, structure, and food at the same time. What looks primitive from a distance becomes, on contact, almost unnervingly intelligent. This is where modern gardeners often sabotage themselves. They make the bed too compact. They use fine soil only, as if roots enjoy suffocation. Or they build beside stagnant water and call the resulting smell nature, when what they have really created is an anaerobic tomb. The old logic is more precise than that. Water must be present, but the root crown must breathe. Organic layers must hold space. The bed must stand slightly elevated, like a lung above a reservoir. The edge plants matter. Sedges, mints, water-tolerant herbs, taro in the right climate. Even squash or maize on a broader bed if the structure is mature enough. These are not decorations. They are collaborators in a hydraulic choreography. I spoke once with a grower in New Mexico named Elena Vasquez, a woman who had spent 11 years fighting alkaline soil, brutal evaporation, and the kind of summer heat that can turn a watering schedule into a full-time job. She built 3 narrow, wet channel beds after studying pre-colonial water agriculture, each one just under 20 feet long. The neighbors thought she was building a mosquito nursery. Her own brother told her she was making vegetable coffins. By midsummer, while nearby raised beds needed irrigation almost daily, Elena was adding water to the channels every several days and harvesting armfuls of amaranth, peppers, celery leaf, and herbs from beds that never seemed to flinch. She told me the most shocking part was not the yield, it was the silence. No frantic hose, no dry crust breaking at noon, no endless cycle of saturation and stress. In the first full season, she estimated her water use for those beds dropped by roughly 40% compared with her conventional beds of similar planting density, while harvest weight climbed enough that she stopped measuring by pounds and started measuring by baskets. Then there was Marcus Reed outside Baton Rouge, where the problem was not drought but chaos. Too much rain, then heat, then fungal collapse, then weeks of punishing sun that baked the upper layer hard as pottery. Marcus converted a flooded corner of his property into a contained canal garden, using salvaged branches, cane, leaf litter, and composted manure to build long, mounded islands between narrow water corridors. He planted okra, chilies, basil, roselle, and a trial row of tomatoes on the highest crowns. He expected a mess. What he got was stability. The channels buffered heat. The mounds shed crown rot better than flat ground. The organic core stayed moist without becoming sour. He said the basil became obscene, waist-high, thick-stemmed, fragrant enough to smell from several feet away. By the end of the season, he had pulled more usable produce from that once-failed wet corner than from any equal area in his conventional plot. His phrase, not mine, was, "I stopped fighting the water and recruited it." That is the psychological threshold, and most people never cross it. They have been trained to treat water as an enemy when it refuses to behave like plumbing. But ancient growers knew that controlled wetness is not the same as waterlogging, just as a river is not the same as a drowned cellar. The difference is design. The difference is whether the system breathes. So if you were to attempt it, you would not rush. You would mark the area at dusk or early morning, when the land reveals where moisture naturally lingers. You would watch how the light hits it. You would notice where weeds grow thick and where the soil stays cool longest. Then you would dig or shape channels with intention, not symmetry for its own sake. You would pile coarse material first, because air is as important as water. You would crown the growing surface above the wet zone. You would mulch the top so the sun must fight for every drop. And then, for the first time in a long time, you would stop thinking like a consumer of garden products and start thinking like a builder of ecosystems. At first, the bed looks rough, almost too rough for modern taste. Not clean enough, not uniform enough. It does not resemble the catalog image of obedience people have mistaken for beauty. But then the plants begin to speak. Leaves stay turgid through heat. Growth becomes aggressive. The color deepens. The roots find the hidden reservoir and stop begging. You realize, with a kind of quiet anger, that what you were taught to dismiss as muddy and primitive may actually be more resilient than the expensive systems sold as progress. And once you see that, once you watch a bed pull strength from water without drowning in it, the old empire stops feeling distant. It feels like an accusation. The real enemy was never drought alone. It was amnesia, professionally packaged. It was the long campaign to convince people that productive agriculture had to be dry, rectilinear, centralized, and ruled by inputs that could be bought, shipped, taxed, and controlled. When the Spanish entered the basin of Mexico in the early 16th century, they did not merely encounter a city. They encountered a hydraulic civilization so sophisticated it must have felt, to the European mind, almost offensive. Tenochtitlan rose from the lake like a vision no medieval farming manual could explain. Causeways cut across shining water, canoes moved food through aquatic streets, and around that imperial heart were chinampas, the so-called floating gardens, though the phrase is too delicate for what they truly were. They were engineered fields, anchored in shallow lake zones, built from mud, vegetation, woven roots, and relentless human intelligence. They turned water from a threat into infrastructure. This matters because the chinampa was not a charming curiosity. It was a machine of abundance. Historians and archaeologists have long described these systems as among the most productive agricultural methods in the pre-modern world, capable of sustaining dense urban populations through intensive, year-round cultivation. The Aztecs inherited and expanded techniques with deeper roots in central Mexico, especially around the Great Lake systems, where earlier Xochimilca and other Nahua-speaking peoples had already learned how to manufacture fertile land from wet environments. The empire did not feed itself, despite the lakes. It fed itself because of them. Mud dredged from canals was rich with nutrients. Aquatic weeds and decaying biomass became compost before the word existed in modern gardening culture. Moisture rose constantly from below. Frost risk softened near the water. Transport became effortless. A canoe could carry what a wagon would choke on. The bed and the canal were not separate things. They were one organism, a partnership between root zone and water corridor, between biology and geometry. And that was precisely why such knowledge became vulnerable. Systems like this are hard to monopolize. They rely on observation, labor, ecology, and local adaptation more than on purchased dependence. They are legible to communities. They empower small growers. They make waste into fertility. They turn weeds, mud, and water into wealth. For conquerors and later colonial administrators, that kind of distributed intelligence is not merely inconvenient, it is politically dangerous. After the conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the violence was not limited to bodies and temples. It extended into land use, water governance, and memory itself. Lakes were drained, redirected, or fragmented over centuries to protect colonial urban interests, control flooding, and reshape the landscape into something more compatible with European priorities. What had been an aquatic agricultural civilization was gradually forced into a different logic, one hostile to the very wetlands that had sustained it. There is a cruel irony here. The colonizers often interpreted wet landscapes as primitive obstacles to be subdued, even while depending on the productivity of indigenous systems they barely understood. The old methods were tolerated when useful, dismissed when inconvenient, romanticized when dying, and forgotten when market agriculture found more profitable narratives. Once industrial agriculture matured, the burial deepened. Wetlands became wasteland. Organic complexity became mess. While someone buying fertilizers to force life through exhausted soil was called modern. That inversion, no one needed to burn ancient abundance and suburban practice. Meanwhile, vast industries rose on the promise that fertility must be imported in bags, that water must be pumped and sprayed, that resilience must be manufactured externally, because landscapes themselves could no longer be trusted. The result is a civilization that routinely destroys wetlands, then complains about water scarcity. It drains sponge ecosystems, hardens soil, strips organic matter, and then acts surprised when fields become thirsty, brittle, and dependent. Yet the buried record never fully disappeared. In Xochimilco, south of Mexico City, remnants of the Chinampa world still endure, though threatened by urbanization, pollution, groundwater extraction, invasive pressures, and the slow violence of modern neglect. Farmers there continue, under immense pressure, to cultivate on landscapes that carry the skeleton of the old aquatic logic. Researchers have studied these systems not as myths, but as living evidence of how ecological design can sustain productivity with astonishing durability when the water matrix remains functional. That is what makes the forgetting so unforgivable. This was not lost because it failed. It was lost because the world around it was reorganized by conquest, urban expansion, and economic systems that reward simplification over intelligence. And once you understand that, the modern garden center begins to look different. Those endless aisles of fixes, those bright bottles promising control, those slogans about efficiency and performance start to resemble the afterlife of a cultural erasure. Not a conspiracy in the childish sense, with whispered villains in dark rooms, but something colder and more ordinary. A civilization that profits from disconnection. If people forget that water can be stored in landscape rather than bought in panic, if they forget that fertility can rise from decomposition instead of factories, if they forget that the garden can behave like a wetland edge instead of a sterile container, Then they become permanent customers and a system built on repeated rescue. The Aztecs, and the peoples before and around them, did not leave behind a quaint gardening trick. They left a challenge, a rebuke. They proved that an empire could be fed by designing with water rather than against it. They demonstrated that abundance does not always emerge from domination. Sometimes it emerges from partnership with mud, roots, sediment, and time. And that is the kind of truth modern culture has a talent for burying. Because once ordinary people remember it, they begin to ask very dangerous questions about everything else they have been taught to buy. Now the mechanism reveals itself, and it is more beautiful than the myths people usually prefer. A Chinampa-like system works because it cheats the most brutal laws of the ordinary garden without breaking the laws of biology. In a conventional bed, the root zone lives on a knife edge. Too dry, and the plant closes its stomata. Growth slows, nutrient flow stutters, and the entire organism shifts from expansion to survival. Too wet, and oxygen disappears from the pore spaces. Roots suffocate, microbes change allegiance, and the bed begins to rot from the inside. This is the prison modern gardeners know so well, the endless oscillation between thirst and drowning. The water-fed raised bed escapes that prison through separation and exchange. The crown of the root zone remains elevated enough to breathe, while a moist reservoir sits below or beside it, feeding the system gradually through capillary action. That phrase sounds clinical, but what it means is intimate. Water climbs. It rises through tiny pores in soil and decomposing organic matter, the way ink creeps through paper or blood moves through the smallest vessels. It does not need a gardener standing over it with a hose every afternoon. It travels because the physics of small spaces pull it upward, and because the organic architecture of the bed creates a ladder for moisture to climb. This is why texture matters so much. A bed built only from fine particles becomes a coffin. The pores are too small, airflow collapses, and saturation turns from gift to suffocation. A bed built with layered stems, branches, roots, leaves, compost, and mineral soil contains a spectrum of pore sizes. The larger spaces hold air. The smaller spaces hold water. Between them, roots find exactly what they need: moisture without permanent submersion, oxygen without desiccation. Modern soil science would call this a balance of water-filled and air-filled porosity. The ancient grower would have simply recognized whether the bed smelled alive, whether it warmed correctly at sunrise, whether the roots pulled hard and white through the matrix instead of blackening into slime. Then there is temperature, the invisible tyrant of the garden. Water changes that too. It stores heat, releases it slowly, and buffers the violence of sudden swings. In hot weather, a nearby canal or saturated lower layer acts like a thermal battery, moderating the root zone so it does not spike as wildly beneath a murderous sun. In cooler nights, that same stored warmth bleeds back into the surrounding microclimate. Around water, frost can soften. Around water, stress can be delayed. Around water, a plant may spend fewer hours in panic and more hours in productive metabolism. That is not romance. That is physics wearing the mask of mercy. The fertility engine is just as ruthless in its elegance. In ordinary gardening, nutrients are often treated like shipments, things delivered from outside. In a Chinampa logic, nutrients circulate through decomposition at the site of growth. Canal sediments, aquatic biomass, leaf litter, root turnover, microbial residues, all of it feeds a system that constantly rebuilds itself from within. As buried organic matter breaks down, it does not merely release nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and trace minerals. It transforms structure. It darkens, softens, and increases the cation exchange capacity of the soil, meaning the bed becomes better at holding nutrients instead of letting them wash away like squandered money. The decay itself is not a side effect, it is the engine room. And below that visible story, an empire of microbes is negotiating every second. Bacteria and fungi colonize the decomposing layers, shredding plant residues into forms roots can actually use. Mycorrhizal fungi extend the reach of roots like hidden nerve fibers, trading minerals and water for sugars. Biofilms form around particles and roots, regulating microenvironments too small for the eye to perceive. In a healthy, water-linked bed, this underground society becomes astonishingly productive because it is not being whipped from one extreme to another. It has moisture stability. It has organic food. It has gradients of oxygen instead of sterile uniformity. Stability, not force, is what creates power. Even weeds and aquatic plants begin to look different through this lens. The plants that emerge around water channels are often mining minerals, shading surfaces, slowing evaporation, feeding pollinators, and offering biomass for return to the bed. The old systems were rarely monocultures in the dead modern sense. They were mosaics. Edges mattered. Companion relationships mattered. The interface between land and water was not wasted space, but biological voltage, a place where species diversity increased resilience. Modern horticulture often fears such complexity, because complexity is harder to standardize, harder to sell, harder to reduce to a label. But resilience is almost always born at the edge, where categories blur and life has more than one way to survive. There is also an oxygen paradox here that confuses many people. They think water means anaerobic collapse, and sometimes it does. But moving or periodically refreshed water near a raised, fibrous bed can actually support healthier conditions than repeated topwatering on compacted, dry ground. When water arrives from below or from the side, roots are not battered by constant surface crusting and shallow dependence. They grow downward, outward, exploratory. As long as the crown remains aerated and the substrate remains coarse enough, the system invites deep resilience. The plant becomes less hysterical, less needy, less at the mercy of the gardener's forgetfulness. And perhaps the most subversive scientific truth is this: productivity in such a system is not just about feeding the plant. It is about reducing stress. A stressed plant spends energy on defense, on damage control, on closing itself against the world. A stable plant expands. It builds leaf area, thickens stems, drives roots, recruits microbes, and turns sunlight into tissue with a kind of calm ferocity. Water-linked growing systems are powerful because they remove the repeated insults that modern gardens accept as normal. They reduce moisture shock. They soften heat shock. They increase nutrient retention. They foster microbial cooperation. They make the landscape itself do part of the labor. So when people dismiss these ancient water-based systems as archaic, what they are really dismissing is an ecological design that solved multiple variables at once: hydration, fertility, transport, microclimate, waste recycling, yield density. That is why the idea still feels dangerous. It does not offer a single trick. It offers a different worldview, one in which the garden is not a patient on life support, but a wet, breathing intelligence structured so well that abundance becomes its natural expression. And once you understand the science, the old empire's achievement stops sounding mystical. It becomes something far more unsettling. It becomes rational. There is a moral hidden in all this wet architecture, and it has very little to do with gardening alone. Civilizations do not merely lose techniques. They lose ways of seeing. They forget how to recognize intelligence when it no longer arrives in the approved costume. A canal choked with reeds looks useless to the hurried eye. A muddy bed layered with decay looks primitive to the consumer trained by polished packaging. But life has never cared much for our branding. Life builds power through relationship, through exchange, through patience, through death becoming nourishment, and water becoming memory. That is the deeper wound of the modern garden. It has been taught to fear dependence on nature while becoming utterly dependent on industry. It has been taught to worship control while producing fragility. It has been taught to admire cleanliness while stripping away the very mess from which resilience is born. And perhaps that is why the chinampa still haunts us. Not because it is exotic, because it exposes us. It reveals how much suffering we now mistake for normal. The thirsty soil, the panicked watering, the annual exhaustion, the endless purchases made to repair problems created by design that never understood the land to begin with. So here is the warning. A culture that forgets how to work with water will eventually beg water for mercy. It will drain its wetlands, harden its ground, poison its rivers, and then stand in the heat, asking why everything feels brittle, expensive, and close to collapse. The garden is only the first place this failure becomes visible. The larger consequences are already moving toward us. But there is also a promise here. Memory can be rebuilt. A single bed can become an argument. A single channel, a single moist root zone, a single season of watching plants thrive where they were supposed to drown can crack open the whole illusion. And once that illusion breaks, other buried knowledge starts calling from the dark. Because the next secret is even stranger. There was another ancient method, just as neglected, that could turn what most gardeners throw away into one of the most potent growth engines in the living world. Until then, keep your hands in the soil and your eyes on the systems beneath the surface. This is Garden Rebellion. And the garden remembers.